Hello everyone, welcome back. For this demo this time around, I thought I'd use one of the other stamp sets in the show, just to show how they work and use a different colour palette. So we're using Thankful Petals, and in this stamp set we've got some gorgeous florals and some fantastic sentiments. Create with passion, thanks, heartfelt thanks, and in art there are no mistakes, only opportunities for creativity. I love that stamp set, and it's quite a substantial size. It's an A5 size stamp set. So this time I'm going to use craft card just to make it a little bit different. Just trying to change it each time just so it looks a little bit different. And since I've been doing the shows, I'm in love with this stencil. I just love this stencil. So I'm going to use this stencil. And what I'm going to use this time is Distress Oxides, Vintage Photo and Ground Espresso. And I'm just going to blend in a simple way the colours over the stencil. I'm making sure I've got plenty of ink actually applied onto that cut and dry foam. Make sure you do the same whether you're using an ink blending tool or whether you're using a piece of cut and dry foam. Make sure that you've got a good layer of ink into that cut and dry foam. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply this colour directly over the stencil. And I'm not holding my stencil in place, I'm just winging it as usual, living dangerously, living on the edge and holding it in place with my hands rather than holding it in place with low tack tape. If you want to make sure that you don't make any errors, then obviously use the low tack tape to hold your stencil in place. You can lift your stencil up just to see how your stencil is going, and that looks beautiful. And if you apply enough ink onto your stencil, then you make sure that you get a wonderful, wonderful blend over your stenciled area. I'm going to apply a touch of that darker colour now, just to add some shading to the stenciling. It's not going to matter too much really when we do the other technique, so it won't matter too much. It's just adding some depth of colour. And I can lift that stencil up and you can see there we've got some beautiful stenciling. So I love that. And if I just hold that, oh, I'm putting my lids on back to front, there we go. And if we just hold that up, you can see the depth that you've got, just a touch of shading here in that colour. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to use some gesso. I'm going to use gesso to apply over the top of the stenciling, but I only want to add a thin layer of that gesso, just to bring some whiteness in, and just to add another layer of texture to my background. And I'm going to apply it in a random fashion. So I don't want to think about it too much. So I'm picking that gesso up onto my palette knife, just turn it to the side so I can see what I'm doing, and then just apply that down the side. And what you will see is the Distress Oxide reacts with the moisture in the gesso, and that will come through. What I can also do is just water that gesso down a little bit while this reacts. Just water that down a little bit, and then I can add, she says, some delicate splatters of the gesso to the background, just to lighten the whole background up a little bit. I love these vintage tones, but just want to lighten it up just a little touch. A few more splatters than are actually coming out would be nice. That's better. Maybe a bit more force was needed. That's much better. There we go. Just wash that brush just so that doesn't dry on solid. Just give that a wipe. And we're just allowing the gesso to react with those Distress Oxides. And I've added some splatters of that gesso just to lighten it up a touch. And what I'm going to do is dry that with a heat tool, just because I want to stamp onto this afterwards. And I will lift this up so you can see it. And it just gives a different look to your card, just something a little bit different. Just turn that over, just so that the card bends both ways. You need to make sure that that layer is completely dry. You can't stamp onto a wet layer. Just test that. Yes, that's nice and dry. Just bend that card a little bit. If I hold that up, can you see that the gesso, the stenciling is still visible, but it's toned everything down? Just a slightly different look for you. So I'm going to be using the large stamp from the stamp set, and as you can see, mine is Well Loved. It's a Well Loved stamp set, that is. And can you see the size of the stamp? It doesn't do it any justice when you look at the packaging. When you look at the packaging, you've got no concept of the size. But if I put my hand there, you can see the size of the stamp. It's a good, substantial size, that is, for a flower stamp. So what I'm going to do now is bring in my background and just judge where I want this flower. So I want it slightly off centre like this. So I'll ink my stamp up, and I'm going to ink with VersaFine Clair. I love flowers that have got good open areas. I always like to design a flower with an open area. Sometimes I like to change it up a bit, as you might see with the next release, but I do like to have a flower with those open areas, and you'll see why shortly. So I'm just giving that a good inking. Just remove that bit of black ink there. And I've just picked up a baby white that's absolutely full of gesso. That was good. So bring in my card, and I normally hold it on the side so I can see exactly where I'm going. So I just want to judge, just looking at this, let's move it up so it's in camera for you. I just want to go off centre slightly so I don't cover up all that stenciling. There will be perfect. And I'm just going to allow that ink to sit as normal onto the background. Again, just lift that stamp, that acrylic block, I do beg your pardon, just lift that acrylic block just so that you can get that central area of that flower. This one's a nice easy one to stamp with. Not too much detail because it's got those nice open areas, but I still want to give it time to sit on that card, especially in this area here where we've got that wet gesso and that wet ink. So just make sure that we've got a good image, and we have there. The acrylic blocks really do help that. And as you can see, I've not covered up all this stenciling. Yes, I really like that. I've not covered all that stenciled area up. And this card's a little bit more absorbent with it being the craft card, so the ink doesn't stay as wet. But I still like to blot that ink. It still takes up a bit of that ink for me. I wish you could see my desk area and my craft space behind me. What a mess. So what I want to do then is I want to get a book page. I have prepared this beforehand, but what I did in the prep was stamp the image onto some book pages. But what I did was I added several book pages together in one go. But this is the reason I like a good open stamp. This is the main reason I like a good open stamp, because you can use those pattern backgrounds, you can use those vintage book pages. Let's move that out of the way. You can use those vintage book pages, and you can stamp those open areas onto the book page or onto your fancy backgrounds or your pattern papers. It looks fantastic with those pattern papers. It just makes your flower look completely different. And if I lift that up, you can see why them open flowers are perfect. So there you've got these like equations in the flower head, and that just works beautifully. So what I've done is I've stamped the flower several times, can you see, onto these. I stamped it once, but I had several layers of book pages just so that it brings me some texture. And what I'm going to do is add these like so, just so that it brings an added interest. So I really like that. I love how the book page brings an added texture for me. I'm just going to add that like so. And I just love the texture of the book pages. Now, if I can just find my other stamp set. I pulled all the stamp sets out ready, but the problem is I keep chucking everything all over the place so that we can't see where anything is. We've got another stamp set in the show, another one of my favourites, and it's this stamp set. It's the Nibs and Mushrooms. I love the detail on this stamp set. I just think it's fantastic. So what I'm going to use is I'm going to use the mushrooms this time. I'm just thinking those mushrooms, a few of those mushrooms would look lovely just stamped at the base there. I think they would look really nice. So I've cut the stem out of the flower just to place it as a mask over the bottom area, just so it's sort of in place. It doesn't have to be perfect. And then I'm going to ink up these mushrooms. I love these little mushrooms with the leaves behind. And I'm a lover of vintage, so I do like the vintage feel of the craft card. Again, applying a good even coat of ink to that stamp, just to make sure it's covered nice and evenly. There we go. And then I'm going to add these to the base, so just make sure that's sort of in place. And I'm going to add these to the base of that card. And I'm just thinking about it now where I want it, so I'm going to add it there. And again, I'm going to allow that ink to sit on that card. Again, lifting so I can get that central area. Lifting again so I can get that central area of the stamp. But because we've got this wet area here with the gesso, I'm just making sure that I lift that several times and allowing that ink to sit. I know it's repetitive hearing those details, but sometimes for new starters to craft, new beginners, they need to know that basic information so that we don't get frustrated with our stamping. And I love that. Absolutely love the fact that what we've got is we've got this gesso background and these mushrooms have just stamped slightly onto the white gesso. I just think that works so well. I love the whiteness here, just how it's, if I just lift that up, you can see here that you've got those white areas that are the gesso underneath. And I think that, and you've even got a touch of gesso here. So applying it randomly really works. And you can still see that stenciling. You've not got rid of that detail. So I love that. We've also got some more sentiments on this stamp set. And what we've got, just try to find another acrylic block. I've used that many acrylic blocks during today. I want to use this sentiment, create with passion. I think that's perfect because I've really enjoyed creating for this one day special. I've really enjoyed playing with these stamps and having a go with the stamps. Sometimes I find that if you sort of narrow down the stamps that you're using, so I've stuck to the one day special images and a couple of the stamps that are on the show, and because I've narrowed it down, I really concentrate, and the more I create, the more designs I want to create. That's what I find with some of the designs. We've just got a bit of something stuck on that stamp set there. Let's just remove that. That's because my stamps are actually used in workshops. So we've just got, somebody's left a bit of paint on there. There we go. Just remove that. So this sentiment says, create with passion. And I think that's a lovely sentiment. Just add this to the base of this card piece. And again, I'm just allowing that ink to sit. I'm not pressing too hard because it's only a small sentiment. It doesn't need too much pressure. Create with passion. That's lovely. And then I'm going to blot that sentiment. As I always do, I still blot the sentiments. And I'm just going to cut that sentiment out, and I won't add too much colour to the sentiment. And if you notice, I'm using the card that we've used in previous demos. I don't waste any of my card. I do use it all to make sure that every scrap is used. Try not to waste anything. So just cut this out, bring this in, and then we'll just add a touch of the brown vintage photo that we used for the stenciling just to the edges of that card, just so that it's got a bit of a vintage feel for the rest of it. And I'm going to add it below where those mushrooms are, like so. Create with passion. I do like that. A nice simple card to create, but not everything has to be overcomplicated. You can still get a lovely result when you've got quality stamps and good strong images. When you've got good strong images, they work really well, especially with all the stamps combined together. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to blend a little bit of this vintage photo around the edges of my card. Just a little touch, just so we add to that vintage feel. Blending that colour, and because I've got a good layer of ink on my cut and dry foam, which we had from the stenciling, there's already a good layer on there. So it means I'm not having to add and, you know, sort of keep repeating myself by dabbing into the ink. There is a good layer of ink on there anyway. That was from the stenciling. And sometimes I don't add this to the edges, but sometimes it needs it. And I think for this vintage piece, we just need to draw that eye in to the focal image. So blending that colour around the outside edges. And sometimes the simplest of techniques are the best. And I have to say, I do love that stenciling in the background. Whoops. And then what I'm going to do is I've got my clips that I like to add to my cards. These are like little metal embellishments. I do like adding these to my card, and I like to think about it before I add them. So I like to think about where they're going. So I often place them first. Now it's going to go down here. I place them first and then decide where they're going. So these clip on to the card just to give a nice metal touch, just to finish that card off nicely. And then if we bring in a black mat, like so, and then what we can do, we'll just go back to those book pages. And if we just look at these book pages, if I just tear another, oh, I've got a bit of a book page here. So we've got some book pages here. This is what I tore the flower out of, so we can use those. So we can use some of those equations and just add those numbers. Just tear, just to add a quirky touch to your card. And it coordinates with this on the background of the stamp, just to make it a cohesive design. So just add a touch of this. The little touches are what finish it off for me. I love doing the little touches. It just finishes it off. And I need one more little bit because we've got the sentiment and that. And when it's not in threes for me, it isn't the correct balance. So I just need a little bit more. That's perfect. Just add a touch of that. Just adding it off kilter so that it's not perfect in line. And there you have our vintage card. And I have to say, I'm really pleased with the stenciling area here. I absolutely love that. I hope you can see that on the camera. And all those little details and the detail on the flower works so well. I really enjoyed that demo. And I'll see you for the next one. Bye for now.